Welcome, welcome, welcome to episode 156 of the show with no name. I'm your humble host, Nick, and today we're going to be exploring this really cool old pioneer cemetery out here in the outskirts of Spokane, Washington. This cemetery goes by the name of the Orchard Prairie Cemetery, but it also goes by the name of the Union Cemetery. Let's get into this. There's a lot of history in this little pioneer cemetery, and I have a lot of people to talk about in this episode today. And I'm going to start out with Gertrude P. Crawford. And she was born on November 8th, 1868 in New York. She would end up in Washington with her husband George at some point in time. She would pass away at the young age of 23 on September 9th, 1892. Her cause of death was pleuritis. Her husband George would remarry and be buried somewhere in Minnesota later in life. So she is here by herself. A tragedy like this is commonplace in these farmer cemeteries out here in Washington state. Wilma Mildred Dierks was born sometime in the year 1919, and she would pass away on January 26, 1997. She was 77 years old. She was born in South Dakota, and she was a 55-year resident of Spokane. She owned and operated the Cedar Rest Haven Nursing Home and was a registered nurse there. She is survived by her husband, 3 sons, and her daughter. William Doak was born on May 27, 1839 in Virginia. He was a veteran of the Civil War, and like many Civil War veterans, he went west in search of a new life. He would pass away on March 12, 1908 at the age of 68 from heart complications. He is buried here at the cemetery with his beloved wife, Julia. Sarah Elizabeth Glassburn was born on June 18, 1890 in Nebraska, and she would pass away on January 23, 1904 of diphtheria. She was only 13 years old. Harold Bird Currier, age 92, passed away at his home on December 20th, 2012, after a long and very interesting life. He was born to Edna Dora and William Bird Currier on February 19th, 1920. His earlier years were spent on Orchard Prairie, attending the one-room school and helping on the farm. He loved to build things and fix things, but mostly he loved to tear things apart and see how they worked. He graduated from Rogers High School in 1939, where he was active in track, drama, and music. He joined the Army Air Force pre-Pearl Harbor in 1941, having been recruited by his chaplain uncle to sing in the chaplain choir. There he met and later married Kathleen Madsen, a talented singer in her own right. During World War II, he was stationed in Nome as a cryptographer and a teletype operator. Then during the Korean War, he was a radio repairman in the Navy, giving him 8 years of service to his country. He and Kathleen had 2 children, Clyde and Roxanne. Tragically, his wife and son were killed in a car accident in July of 1952. In 1954, he married Edna Dorothy Mills, and she would be his wife and helpmate for 57 years. He adopted Edna's daughter, Kathy, and then they had 2 more sons, Alan and Stephen. His whole working life was spent repairing or building or inventing various types of electronics, including radio, TV, and electric organs. His greatest work was as a builder and a tuner of pipe organs, including the one he installed in his own home. He and Edna traveled all over the West for many years, serving churches big and small. He loved hunting, fishing, and traveling with his wife Edna, gardening, and most of all, music. He whistled everywhere he went and always had a song for any occasion. Lloyd J. Straussai was born on March 3, 1920, right here in Spokane, Washington. He would pass away on October 12, 1998. Lloyd was a World War II U.S. Army veteran who was inducted on March 14, 1942 at Fort Lewis. He was assigned to the 607th Tank Destroyer Battalion. He arrived in France on June 16, 1944. His battalion was attached to the 90th Division 3rd Army under General Patton. He was wounded in early December of 1944 in Germany, but he rejoined the battalion on Christmas Eve. He was awarded the Purple Heart and various other medals for his service. He would get married and have 2 children after he returned home. Carl Raymond Sprague was born on March 24, 1989, right here in Spokane, Washington. He was only 14 years old when he passed away. He died on June 19, 2003, from injuries suffered during a motorcycle accident. Last but not least in today's episode, I'm going to talk about a man whose name was Carl Clifford Paulson. He was born in 1895, and I found a story about him that was written by one of his family members. Carl Paulson, the man who pioneered grass seed growing and grass field burning in Spokane County, died last week at the age of 101. Friends and relatives of lifelong Orchard Prairie farmer Carl Paulson remembered him Saturday as a gentle optimist, an adventurer, and an outdoorsman who caught his first fish in the Little Spokane River in 1899. And still fished off the coast of Venezuela when he was 93. About 150 people filled rows of folding chairs in the Central Grange building. A few shed tears, but most smiled as stories of Paulson's life were told. Not long before he died, someone asked how he was feeling. "Grateful," Paulson said, "for all that I've seen and done." Paulson bought his farm on Orchard Prairie in 1929. Raising cabbage was backbreaking and time-consuming work. This valley primarily raised vegetables, and that's pretty labor intensive, remembered Paulson's 62-year-old son, John Paulson. It was tough to find laborers to help during World War II. Paulson switched in the 1940s from growing cabbage to grass because it was less labor intensive. He decided to burn field stubble simply as a way of cleaning fields after harvest. His farming methods were very, very good, remembered farmer Walter Clothier, a neighbor. Grass farming turned out to be profitable. Some said it was Paulson's friendship with Arden Jacklin, a valley farmer who was also interested in growing grass, that sparked the grass seed production in the inland Northwest. Paulson spent most of his free time hunting cougars, raccoons, and bobcats with hounds he trained himself. He trained spaniels as bird dogs. Friends called him a steward of the earth. During the grass harvest, Paulson watched out for nesting pheasants. If we found a nest, we couldn't go near it until the little ones hatched, John Paulson said. In the 1950s, Paulson began spending the fruits of his labor on world travel. During his life, he toured China, Europe, Africa, and Russia. But Paulson had his share of overseas adventures long before the 50s. During World War I, he served in northern France, where he was wounded by shrapnel. Paulson was a gifted athlete who played basketball in high school and semi-professional baseball afterwards. Kids looked up to him. Men now in their 60s remember working on Paulson's farm as children. He seemed always willing to help out the kids in the neighborhood, said one neighbor named Darrell. Some of those friendships with the youngsters he employed lasted a lifetime. He was a great man and a perfect friend, said Leon Buckles, who now lives in West Africa, but attended Paulson's weekend memorial. "I'll never have another friend like that," he stated. When you're in your 90s, you don't wade the bonefish flats in Venezuela. When you're in your 80s, you don't run cougars with hounds. Sometimes catnapping under a tree at night during sub-freezing temperatures. That is, unless you are a man like Carl C. Paulson, a remarkable sportsman who died a few days ago at the age of 101. Until the last 2 years of his life, he seemed to his friends to be immune to the ravages of aging. Paulson, a veteran of the First World War, was one of the most admired and envied fly fishers and hunters in the Spokane region. He had the stamina of a long-distance runner, the talent to train champion bird dogs and hounds, the instinct to catch a fish when others couldn't, the imagination to create effective fly patterns, and the knowledge and insight to know where the game animals would be. In short, he knew more about fishing, hunting, and dog training than nearly all of his contemporaries. His friends will remember him not only as a terrific fly fisher and hunter, but as a dignified, reserved, and polite man who had a sly sense of humor. One of the most repeated comments by the men who knew him was, "I hope I'll be in as good a shape as he is if I live to be 90. When his death was announced at last week's meeting of the Empire Inland Fly Fishing Club, there was a collective gasp of surprise and regret. No one in the club was more revered and admired than the grand old man who went everywhere and did everything long before most of its members were born. Paulson fished thousands of lakes and streams throughout North America. He was one of the few fly fishers who could say that he fished trout-filled waters back in the good old days. I hope you enjoy the rest of the videos of this awesome historic cemetery out here on the outskirts of Spokane, Washington. The cemetery goes by the name of the Orchard Prairie Cemetery. Thank you.